England is full of wonderful places, but for the last 15 years, the people over at ilivehere.co.uk have been voting not for the best, but for the worst places to live in England. The winner in 2022 was the Buckinghamshire county town of Aylesbury, but if you scroll through the list of this year's top, or rather bottom 50, you'll find a variety of names that you likely know well. Coventry, Middlesbrough, Barnsley, Leicester, Blackburn, Portsmouth, Ipswich, Grimsby, Peterborough. Over 100,000 people voted in the web poll, but while it's easy to look at the negatives and write off some places in the country as simple no-go zones, in this video we're going to shine a positive light on a number of places that are often ranked among the worst in England, and by the end, hopefully, you'll be excited to visit some of these towns for yourself too. Let's start off with the place that just sneaked in at number 50, Southampton, down on England's south coast. One voter on the web poll noted Southampton as the flawed pearl of the south, and while the city may indeed have its flaws, it's a place with a whole lot more to offer than just a ferry port leading to the Isle of Wight. By far and away the largest city in the region, Southampton is filled to the brim with history, most notably in the form of some of the most impressive medieval city walls in England. A nearly 700-year-old circuit that originally ran for 1¼ miles around the medieval town, roughly half of the historic fortifications remain standing today, incorporating majestic gateways like the Bar Gate and West Gate, neighboured by the beautiful Tudor Merchants' Hall, as well as grand architectural features like the arcades and the impressive Arundel Tower. Walking the route of the walls is one of the highlights of a visit to Southampton, as you learn the story of how they were built in the 14th century to protect against the threat of French raiders, who often landed on England's south coast and burned towns to the ground. Over the centuries, much of the walls were stripped away, but what remains today is a true treasure, and often an underrated piece of the nation's medieval history. Moving slightly further down the list, at number 42, we find the Lincolnshire town of Boston. On ilivehere.co.uk's poll, attached to Boston's name is the quote, "everything bad done to excess." But what you might not know about this historic town by the River Witham is that it was once second only to London in wealth and economic importance in England. The symbols of Boston's historic significance are on plain display wherever you look in the modern town. Its enormous parish church, popularly known as the Boston Stump, is the largest parish church in all of England, and can be seen from miles away across the flat landscape of the Fens, and sometimes even as far away as Norfolk from across the Wash. The Boston Stump overlooks an equally huge market square, the home of local commerce for nearly 900 years, and which in the medieval era hosted trade fairs visited by dignitaries from all over Europe, as Boston was renowned as an exporter of highly valuable wool, and even existed as a port of the prestigious European Trading Association, the Hanseatic League. Even on a short walk around Boston's town centre, you'll see the cobbles and waters on which all this immensely important trade took place, while you'll also be treated to a range of beautiful architecture from a number of different historical eras, and the story of how locals eventually went on to found the city of Boston across the pond in the United States of America. Next up, as we continue scrolling through the results of this poll of England's so-called worst places to live, is number 34, Coventry. Quoted on the website as being the only place in the country where living there could be confused as a punishment, Coventry, much like Boston, has an often unsung history as one of the most important places in medieval England. Now, when most people think of Coventry today, they think of this kind of scene. Grey behemoths built in the mid-20th century after the city had been razed to the ground by German bombs in the Second World War. But if you look a little deeper, you'll notice that Coventry, had it not fallen victim to the Blitz, could have been one of England's most beautifully medieval cities. While it's certainly a place of intrigue for those who admire post-war town planning, if you love your history, Coventry is an absolute treasure trove. The cathedral is by far and away the city's most spectacular landmark, the soaring spire and shell of this huge medieval church serving as both a reminder of the city's historic significance and a memorial to the horrors of the Second World War. The pairing of the medieval cathedral with the modern rebuild next door also makes for a striking clash between the centuries, and that's a riveting clash that you'll find yet more examples of as you explore the city. Famously, Coventry was the place where Lady Godiva is said to have rode through the streets naked back in the 11th century, and alongside a grand monument to her at the heart of the city's Broadgate, you'll find countless other highlights, from picturesque timber-framed pubs on cobbled streets to the remains of a grand medieval monastery and the old town walls, while in more modern terms, Coventry also boasts the Transport Museum, the largest transport collection in Britain, and a spectacular show of the riveting industrial legacy of what was once known as Motor City. Just 2 spots below Coventry on the web poll, meanwhile, is the nearby city of Leicester, ranking at number 32. One voter says about Leicester that they feel threatened by the sheer amount of roadmen in the city, but it's the sheer amount of history on display in Leicester that should certainly entice people to visit the city. You'll no doubt remember that Leicester is the place where King Richard III's body was amazingly uncovered in a car park back in 2012, and while there's now a whole area of the city dedicated to Richard and his links with Leicester, there's so much more to see wherever you look. Once upon a time the site of Roman settlement, Leicester is home to one of the oldest landmarks in England, the Jewry Wall, built around 1900 years ago by the Romans, while elsewhere in the city, you'll find equally impressive historic landmarks, including the Grand Cathedral, the immense medieval Guildhall, and the rather quaint remains of Leicester Castle, located in a lovely area of the city, also busy today with students from one of Leicester's 2 major universities. The city is also notable for Leicester Market, a traditional covered trading floor with 700 years of history, but yet more shopping opportunities abound on the city's bustling High Street, Haymarket and Gallowtree Gate, which converge around the iconic clock tower, a beautiful and popular meeting point at the heart of this proud city. Moving further down the list to number 24, we find a city that for a long time served as a bit of an easy, albeit undeserved punchline: Hull. Though cited on ilivehere.co.uk as a living hell for decent folk, Hull, particularly in the last 20 years, has emerged as one of England's most striking cities, both for its range of modern architecture and its wealth of history and things to do. Once upon a time a vitally important port, and in the 18th century the home of the largest, most modern docks in England, Hull has centuries of maritime history to count on, but it's also notable as one of the first planned towns in England, originally built as a personal project of King Edward I, which is why its full name is Kingston, or King's Town, upon Hull. In 1642, it was at Hull's Beverley Gate, the ruins of which are still visible today, that King Charles I was refused entry to the town in an unprecedented show of dissent that may be considered the first spark of the English Civil War, while just a few decades later, the locals, always known for their rebellious spirit, again defied the monarchy by declaring their support for William of Orange, in the lead up to his deposition of King James II in the so-called Glorious Revolution. Hull's beautiful cobbled old town is also home to landmarks including the birthplace of anti-slavery campaigner William Wilberforce, and unusually, the world's smallest window. But in the first couple of decades of the 21st century, Hull has also been revived after a period of decline, with a range of spectacular new landmarks. That includes odd quirks like the swinging Scale Lane Bridge, to the redeveloped Prince's Dock, and to the Deep, a brilliant aquarium overlooking the Humber estuary, and inside which you can even ride in a lift through a tank filled with sharks, an absolute must in what is now a must-visit city. Now just across the Humber from Hull, and a few places further down the list at number 18, you'll find Grimsby, often unfairly caught up by the supposedly grim image suggested by its name. Though one voter on the web poll called Grimsby backward, cold and unfriendly, this is yet another town which, despite its problems, really doesn't deserve the poor reputation it's gained in just the last few decades. Once upon a time the home of the world's largest fishing fleet, and the place where no less than 10% of all the fish eaten in Britain at the turn of the 20th century was caught, Grimsby arguably boasts a prouder fishing heritage than any other town in the country. And although the industry sadly fell away in the late 20th century, owing to declining demand and damaging new European regulations, this town is gradually beginning to find its feet again, all the while celebrating the centuries of history that brought it to where it is today. Home to recent redevelopments including the beautiful new St James's Square in the shadow of Grimsby Minster, and the recently renamed Plaza, home to a popular waterborne pub on a quay by the River Freshney, Grimsby has changed a good deal in the past few years. But around the town you'll also find calls to its past. From the Great Grimsby Seal that tells the story of the town's founding by the Vikings, to the enormous Victoria Mills, the Grimsby Dock Tower, once one of England's tallest buildings, and so much more. Plus, a great day out is but a short distance away in the neighbouring town of Cleethorpes, still one of northern England's favourite seaside resorts. From Grimsby, let's now scroll into the top 10 of the web poll, allegedly the worst places to live in England. At number 10 is Bradford, the third largest city in Yorkshire. Though described on the web poll as the land of dreams if you dream of takeaways and pound shops, Bradford offers much more than that, and is even set to be the UK's newest city of culture in 2025. Bradford certainly fell on hard times after the collapse of its traditional industrial sphere, the worst example arguably being a gaping hole in the ground that existed for years in the early 21st century, where the Broadway shopping centre is now. But the city has now begun to really forge its own path ahead, counting on its history, vibrant community, links with neighbouring cities and more to entice visitors, who'll be more than pleasantly surprised at what the city has to offer. Once upon a time known as Woolopolis for its central role in England's textile trade in the 19th century, Bradford is home to an array of beautiful Victorian architecture, from the immense City Hall to the Wool Exchange, and the atmospheric industrial area known as Little Germany, while the city is also notable as the home of the delightful National Science and Media Museum, grand theatres like the Alhambra and St George's Hall, and more. And if the city centre isn't enough, Bradford is just a stone's throw away from some of the loveliest towns and villages in Yorkshire, especially the likes of Oakworth and Haworth in so-called Bronte country, the famed literary Bronte sisters born just on the outskirts of the modern city of Bradford in the early 19th century. Approaching the end of the list now, at number 5 is an old favourite among voters at ilivehere.co.uk, Peterborough, which between 2019 and 2021 was voted 3 years running as the worst place to live in England. While one voter calls the atmosphere in Peterborough draining, this Cambridgeshire city is all too often known for its weaknesses, with its best side rarely, if ever, mentioned. Though heavily redeveloped in the late 1960s as a so-called new town, relics of Peterborough's surprisingly illustrious history do remain, the best example of which is without doubt the spectacular Peterborough Cathedral, very possibly one of the most beautiful in England. Tucked away off the city's main streets in a calming and pleasant close, Peterborough Cathedral has remained largely intact over the last 900 years since it was built in the 12th century, and it's also seen some important events and people pass through. Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was buried inside in 1536, and in 1587, Mary Queen of Scots too was laid to rest inside Peterborough Cathedral, although she was later moved to Westminster Abbey. Beyond the cathedral, Peterborough also boasts a sprawling market square, at the heart of which there stands the beautiful church of St John the Baptist and the exquisite 17th century Guildhall, both of which are neighboured by the huge Queensgate shopping centre, while a walk further away from the heart of the city will bring you to the popular paths alongside the River Nene, along which trade with Peterborough historically took place. But what of the town that knocked Peterborough off its perch? Well, if we scroll down to the very bottom of this often controversial web poll, you'll find that the place voted as the worst to live in England in 2022 is none other than Aylesbury, the county town of Buckinghamshire, and described on the website as an eyesore concrete jungle. Now Aylesbury, just to the north of the picturesque Chiltern Hills, home to some of the loveliest and most affluent villages in England, may seem like a bit of a surprise winner of a list of the country's worst places to live, because as well as the lovely surrounding countryside, Aylesbury has more than its fair share of attractions. In a modern sense, the impressive Waterside Theatre, beside a historic arm of the Grand Union Canal, stands as one of Aylesbury's more dynamic landmarks, playing host to local and touring productions, and serving as the venue of the historic local music club Friars, which in 1972 was the place where none other than David Bowie debuted the character of Ziggy Stardust on stage. There's a statue dedicated to Bowie in the centre of town now, and he's just one of a number of famous faces associated with Aylesbury. Ronnie Biggs, one of the band who perpetrated the Great Train Robbery, was tried at the county court here, while Aylesbury is also closely associated with the author Roald Dahl, to whom a children's gallery in the town centre is dedicated today. And there's even more. Aylesbury played an important role in the English Civil War back in the 17th century, and a statue of local hero John Hampden, the local MP and a leading parliamentarian in the conflict, exists on the town's market square today, which itself is surrounded by a variety of historic buildings, particularly pubs, with Aylesbury home to one of the greatest densities of pubs per head in the country. So there's plenty to see and do in Aylesbury, as there is in pretty much all of the towns which appear on the list of England's so-called worst places to live. Yes, there is certainly a difference between a flying visit to any one of these towns and calling them home, but it's important to remember that even those places with poorer reputations have so much to offer, and there are without doubt some fantastic things to see and do in England's worst towns. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to taking a trip for yourself to a place that you perhaps might not have considered before.